Luke Macias, Director of the Defend Texas Liberty PAC. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank
So
you for having me.
you bet. And so I wanted to ask you about this billboard that your organization has created and put up across the House district of State Representative Glenn Rogers. Talk to me about how this came about.
Ultimately, the Defend Texas Liberty PAC has been, since its creation, dedicated to making sure that Republican voters know when some Republican elected officials team up with Democrats to pass liberal agenda items. Some of that time that's policy, and recently it was involved with a teaming up of the Uniparty to impeach one of the most conservative attorney generals in the country, Ken Paxton. And so we went into Glenn Rogers' district with a number of billboards that went up, just telling people that he just recently teamed up with over 60 Democrats to impeach Attorney General Ken Paxton. And this is something our PAC, again, has done consistently with liberal Republicans wherever they are in the state. And so we will communicate to voters via any and all communication methods to ensure that they really know what's going on in Austin with individuals who campaign one way, but then go down there and often govern a different way. They try to prioritize policy issues that they would never run on, that they would never talk about at a town hall. They get to Austin, they get a different set of priorities. They team up with enough Democrats to pass those priorities and they come home. So that's why we decided to do what we did with the billboard campaign.
And this is the first one, is that correct?
Yeah, there are a number of billboards up in Glenn Rogers' district.
Why him?
He's one of many more liberal Republicans. Ultimately, the way the Texas House works is that you have over 85 Republicans that could pass anything they wanted to pass, but there are 20 to 30 more liberal Republicans that will team up with Democrats to help a lot of liberal agenda items get through. Once those 20 or 30 cut a deal with the Democrats, the truth is everyone knows the cake's already been baked. Leadership has already cut the deal. So then most of the other Republicans who wouldn't necessarily go along with that end up just voting that way because they know it's already going to pass. They know the impeachment's going to take place. They know the budget's going to pass. They know property tax relief is going to fall short of what it should have been. So they'll vote for it anyways. So we end up focusing on the more liberal Republicans across the state in most of our efforts because we understand that that's the actual coalition in Austin that keeps this stuff from happening.
As you know, I think, what was it, 70% of the Republican House members voted to impeach Ken Paxton. And so should those 70%, those other Republicans, expect billboards in their communities, in their districts?
I think we're looking at billboards across the entire state. It's not just billboards, though. We're ultimately we have been from the beginning communicating with millions of Texas Republicans, whether it's texting their phones, putting up billboards, sending mail. Ultimately, our goal and desire and what we're focused on is making sure that Republican voters know what's going on. So I was actually surprised with how many people voted against Dade Phelan with the impeachment. I'm really proud of the over 20 Republicans that were willing to do that. They were essentially told by Dade and Dustin Burrows and Craig Goldman and some of his leadership team that this vote is a vote for leadership. If you vote against the impeachment, you're voting against Dade Phelan himself. And to have over 20 Republicans do that, I think was a courageous sign that his power structure is absolutely falling apart. And so we're going to continue to communicate to voters whose members have picked more loyalty to the speaker over them as individual citizens and the constituents of those state representatives.
Let me ask you a question as far as just the articles of impeachment themselves.
Yep.
These representatives heard the articles that day back at the end of May on that Memorial Day weekend, and they had to come to a tough vote. And most of the Republicans voted to impeach. And so I'm wondering, aside from the politics of it all, if they felt as if the impeachment had merit and these articles had merit, why shouldn't they have voted that way?
Well, it's hard to say that you're going to divide the politics from a vote that was inherently political. These state representatives ultimately didn't like the political decision that voters made in the Republican primary. Many of them, their biggest donors, Texans for Lawsuit Reform, other organizations, spent millions of dollars to try to unseat Ken Paxton in the Republican primary. And many of these state representatives, I guarantee if you poll them, all the more liberal establishment types, voted for one of the more moderate choices, George P. Bush, Eva Guzman. When that didn't happen, when that didn't succeed, they ultimately withdrew their support and hoped that he wouldn't win in the general. And then he did. He won by a 10-point margin. So they then said, what do we do to overturn that election and place someone we want in the position? And the reason we can say that it was a politically driven decision is because of the way it was done. There's only one statewide official who's ever been impeached in the history of Texas. In 1917, it was a governor. And it was months that went into the impeachment process in the Texas House. And even then, I would argue, just from the historical viewpoint of that situation, it was also a very political decision that was made by political players that wanted to try to see if they could unseat the governor through the impeachment process. But this was done secretly, quietly, and then basically these representatives were told 72 hours before, you're going to vote to impeach a guy. And you're going to vote to impeach him on a bunch of stuff that we're going to tell you he did. And then you can decide in 48 hours if you're going to politically align yourselves with us. And I think ultimately that was the decision they made. So that's the unfortunate reality of what happened in the final weeks. If Dade Phelan and Andrew Murr and these members had serious concerns over these allegations, one, they could have brought them up in the primary. They didn't. They quietly hoped that Texans for Lawsuit Reform and other groups that were spending millions of dollars would succeed in unseating Ken Paxton. They then stayed quiet in the general election, hoping that he would not succeed as he did. And then they said, what can we do to overturn that election? So that's the unfortunate reality I think we find ourselves in.
So what do you hope the impact is of the billboard, of this website created by Dr. Steve Hosty of Houston, and of these resolutions by the Texas GOP and the various local GOPs across Texas?
Ultimately, the hope is that we actually preserve what we've fought for and created in Texas, which is an increasingly more conservative Republican Party. You basically have the establishment side of the GOP making one of their last-ditch efforts to flex the muscle that they have to try to unseat one of the most conservative attorney generals in the country, but also thumb their nose at the very voters that select the leaders of the party. That's ultimately what a lot of this comes down to. So I think that's why you have the party rising up. That's why you have organizations and conservative groups stepping up and saying, no, we're not going to go quietly. And so I hope that the result is that more and more Texans who see what's happening actually are willing to fight to make sure that we have more conservative representation, especially in the Texas House of Representatives, because ultimately the Texas Senate passed dozens of conservative policies that languished in the Texas House. This happens every session, and this is yet another reason with the Ken Paxton impeachment. It just is the cherry on top of a session where this lower chamber that is largely influenced by the Democrat minority fell short. And that's why they're getting the pressure they're getting. And I think it's something they deserve based on their job performance.
So if the question is this just a symbol of the rift in the Texas GOP? What would the answer be?
I think that it's absolutely yet another symptom of the disease. The Ken Paxton impeachment is a larger symptom. It's a significant symptom of a broader divide and disease, which is the fact that you have individuals who want to run as Republicans. They want to go back to their constituents and say all the right things. But then when they get to Austin, they actually want to govern in a way that keeps Democrats more happy with the outcomes. They want to give them enough wins to keep them from getting too upset. And they want to give the voters that they promised all of these things to just a couple of the wins to keep them satisfied so that they can stay in power. I think that ultimately that is the bigger battle at hand. And the Ken Paxton impeachment is the current battle within that broader war that we find ourselves in.
So it's not about the essence and the accusations within the articles of impeachment.
The accusations have been made for a long time. These accusations have been told to voters for a significant amount of time. Voters have been informed there's a judicial process. There is a justice process. Ultimately, what the impeachment process is about is subverting the justice system. We have three branches of government, right? And when the legislature wants to actually not only be the legislative branch and the judicial branch, but also the electorate, that is when we have completely torn asunder from the even principles we have. right? You have elected politicians who say, not only do I want to be the legislative branch, I also want to be the judicial branch. I also want to be the district attorney. I want to be the judge. I want to be the jury. And by the way, I want to be the voters themselves. I want to select who our attorney general is. If they select the wrong person, I want him out. And then I want the executive branch to pick his replacement. And so that is a problem. It's fundamentally a problem that tears all this apart. And so I think that is the focus of the impeachment itself. Is that what we're going to establish as precedent for the future going forward? You had even the most, the one Democrat that actually stood up against this was Harold Dutton, one of the second most senior Democrat. And he stood up and said, this is going to be something we're basically look back on and are embarrassed by. You had liberal Republicans and conservative Republicans, Travis Clardy and Tony Tinderholt, John Smithy, who's really in the middle of both of those two ideologically, all three of them saying, hey, this is going to set a dangerous precedent for what we will do moving forward. And when legislatures look back 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, they're going to look back and say, oh, we can just do whatever we want. And right now, what we have in Texas is the precedent that says impeachment is very rarely done. And when it's done carefully, it's done slowly, methodically, and transparently. And that this process has been anything but.
Luke Macias, director of the Defend Texas Liberty PAC. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
I really appreciate it, Jack. Thank you for having me.